So guys,
What's up?
we're in a
What's up?
big year, often considered to be trivial year, because the presidential elections are upon us. And I think that this year, more than any other year, I find in my lifetime has brought a lot of turmoil, a lot of drama into the mix as far as how people are reacting to everything going on politically. So
It's true.
because you both comprise, you're both the pillars of AMP Consulting Group and my very dear friends,
Yes.
how do you feel, Al? I guess we could start very informally, riff, about the elections and how you see this year playing out, because I'm sure we're getting a lot of questions about that. What do you see happening this year? And then maybe we can touch upon what everyone's predicting for next year, what typically happens after a presidential election year.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, a timely question, because I think in the last few elections, it's been the noisiest that we've ever remembered it. Just everything is so like amplified, how people feel about one person or another person, or kind of these sides that get taken. So I think that's been interesting, and that certainly makes its way into markets to some degree, right? And I'd say some degree in that, like initially there's some uncertainty, but then everyone realizes that it really doesn't matter who's president, and the data kind of backs that up. So I think a lot of times presidents get credit for good and bad when a lot of it doesn't really have as much to do with them as other kind of economic forces. So certainly policy is important, but I think what's happening now is we're in a world where narratives are more important, and a lot of the things that people believe, true or not, are really what kind of are shaping public opinion, whether it's true or not. So
Can I touch upon that?
Of course.
So Marcin, I mean, you and I tend to be a little bit more on the same wavelength as far as how things are being run and parties, and without getting too deep into it. Do you agree with Al as far as it doesn't matter which person or which party is taking the seat?
I'm more data driven. So we actually ran some numbers historically, and across when we have a presidential election year like we have right now, we've had about 24 presidential election years going back to 1928, which is the start of the modern stock market. And when you look at the overall sample, the market is about 12% in a presidential election year. So looking back at data, what would we expect in the market in 2024? Somewhere around 12%. But funny that you say that, because when you subdivide the sample into whether the Democrat was elected president or Republican was elected president, as I say, we had 24 elections since 1928. Democrats won 13 of those, and Republicans won 11. And when you subdivide the data, the market is actually up 15% when a Republican is elected, and only 8% when a Democrat is elected. So at least initially, the market favors the Republicans, at least in a year of a presidential election. There's about a 7% difference in returns.
Oh my!
In the year of a presidential election.
I wonder why.
Right. So I think that's part of it, where you can parse data any which way. If you just look at overall, like if you had invested, and this is probably more to the point as to why it doesn't matter who's in.
You're speaking markets.
It just in terms of the markets really don't care who's in presidency. Like you might get some type of noise in the data of someone getting elected, but if you put $1,000 at the end of 1953, if you had just invested during the times Democrats were in, your 1,000 would have grown to about 50,000. If you had just invested during times when Republicans were in, their 1,000 would be about 37,000. If you had just stayed invested and didn't care, that 1,000 would be about 1.5 million now. So the bigger point is that there might be noise in the data that can be manipulated to serve a purpose, but there's not that many elections, right? They happen every 4 years, and if you look at really sample size, it's not a huge sample size. The truth of the matter is markets don't care who's in president. For the most part, markets tend to trend upwards. And that's really the things we've been trying to convey to everyone's clients, is that really how you feel is not as important as what capitalism does for markets.
Makes sense. In other words, just keep the emotion out of
That's
it.
right.
But
Stay
certainly,
the course, refine your plan.
certainly a lot of the things that are happening now in the world always comes on the agenda of things like wars. We're having wars in Israel, China possibly, and Russia. fears of recession. So these are the things that are often on every election kind of come up.
Makes sense. No, it does. There are a lot
I'd
of
love to
factors.
ask you guys, right? Because there's this disconnect in terms of like, I think people largely think,
I might need a sip.
well, it's just a thought, right? Because I think for full transparency, I think people on both sides of the aisle can be clownish, right? And a lot of it gets extrapolated. So I'm probably more in the middle than anything, but certainly lean a little more left. And thinking about the fact that the economy is not in terrible shape right now, but if you look at it, if you were to hear news, it sounds like the economy is the worst it's ever been. And I saw this great statistic that it showed the swing states. It looked at all the swing states, so Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, many of the states in which we'll actually decide the election, and they were posed two questions. They were saying, how do you feel the economy is in your state, and how do you feel the economy is in the United States? To a T, all of those swing states said the economy in our state is better, more favorable.
Really?
But the overwhelming majority said the economy nationally was worse, despite a recent Wall Street Journal showing the data doesn't point to any of that. Stock market's at an all-time high, unemployment's still low. A lot of the data doesn't support the narrative. Do you think Trump is just a great marketer, like knows how to tap into the pulse of what's happening? Or do you think it's just something that's an outlier, like maybe President Biden's age, or something that's like a not necessarily in the data, but people are getting their signals from that?
I think my personal opinion, and I think factually, there have been too many executive orders brought forth and a lot of unraveling of strong policies, a lot that has actually worked for this country and strengthened our country. I don't think the numbers lie. We all know, being in the industry, that the stock market overall is up right now, although it's been really up in some categories more than others, especially that with that Magnificent Seven beginning in January through at least the first quarter, right? In any case, I find that our deficit has never been where it is right now. I think that a lot of very poor decisions are being made. I feel like a lot of hardworking Americans are pouring their heart and souls into what they do day to day, paying their taxes, feeding their families, rolling up their sleeves and working hard in an effort to save for retirement and achieve their own personal goals. At the same time, we're being infiltrated by other populations which are being given things that they're not having to earn or work hard for. So I don't think that that is a very strong representation of what this country was formed on, and I do oppose it. I just feel like there's a lot of negative surrounding the decisions that have been made and how they've affected us domestically, which is what we should be most concerned about versus everyone else globally. So, it's...
And I think part of this happiness is people's propensity to buy. Even though the economy is very strong, the average person's salary is only up about 6 to 8% because wage inflation is only about 2 or 3%. And if you look at the price of homes, for example, that have risen in our area over 30%, that leaves a lot of people very poor. They can't buy homes, grocery prices are up, cost of education is up. So even though when you're looking at the general trends, the economy does look strong, the gap between the rich and the poor just keeps getting wider and wider. And basic necessities in a country like the United States, like a home or food, are difficult for people to achieve because of the massive inflation that we've had in the past 3 or 4 years.
I agree. I think the dollar's certainly purchasing less, and people do feel poorer than they might have, 3, 4, 5, 6+ years ago when Trump was president, or even, his predecessors were in power. And I feel like if we don't correct that, we're down a very nasty path. And it's not comforting to feel that way for any of us. Doesn't matter what side of the spectrum you're on.
Yeah. No, because to that point, all the presidents spend. And I think more was spent under Trump than in history. Again, not a lot his fault, but a lot like the COVID that came, that was like a one in a lifetime type of thing.
But what did the balance sheet look like then?
Just as
on the
bad.
flip side?
Worse now, but just as bad. So that's where like the structural, that's where I'm wondering, are these things with inflation structural? So like I just feel like, right, if Trump wasn't president today, I feel like he would say, look at the market, it's at all-time highs. Look at inflation, it's coming down. Look at employment, it's super low. And he would be right, right? And he would champion that as a reason for success. And there's like this complete lack of like marketing ability almost on the Democratic side to be able to effectively communicate that things are not as bad as they sound.
Oh, they have.
But I think part of it is because he appears, and I say this respectfully, like feeble. Like he doesn't appear very strong in that seat. And I don't know if that overshadows a lot of what the actual data says. And the actual data is showing that things are not, I'm not saying great, but they're not as bad as certainly you would think. And that's just politics, right? You're always going to paint the other side. But I just think, like, I wonder if that's more of like an ability to touch into a nerve, to that populist nerve that you're talking, because I think you're exactly right. When you print a lot of money,
and I think this is a question that Ronald Reagan asked a long time ago. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Is a general person better off today than they were 4 years ago? Probably the answer is no. Because
are any of us worse off today than we were?
I'm not the general person. I don't represent the general society because our income levels are significantly higher than the average citizen. The average citizen makes about $70,000 a year.
That's true.
So you definitely have to, we have to think about the demographic of the majority of the population of our country and how they're impacted. Also factors, you know, how many people might have one or more children and how that impacts the family.
How many people are working 2 jobs now versus 4 years ago?
Just
There's
to
a
make
lot of
ends
things
meet.
that go into
No, it's a
it,
good question. They're good questions.
And
How much of that's structural versus what actually happened now is what I guess is the question. Right.
But you know what, to your point, it's ironic because obviously we're all in cahoots here with a lot of the you know, the bread and butter and the facts, and at the same time, we peacefully differ in certain opinions surrounding, you know, many topics and many factors that have to do with politics. But I find that the media, for the majority, and correct me if I'm wrong, favors trying to position Biden as a person who, you know, is competent, and they try to sort of safeguard his position and make it seem as though the decisions that have been made and also the current state of our country is that of, you know, growth and is that of continued prosperity. And I don't necessarily agree that that is the case. And when we really look at it, President Trump's stature and his overall well-being, I think, is light years beyond Biden's, but they're only, you know, 4 or 5 years apart at best. I believe it's 4 years apart in age. So I think we might all agree that in general, it would be ideal to find a president going forward that might be a little younger, assuming that they're going to carry an 8-year term, so that they're able to. I don't want to hold that seat under any circumstances, and don't envy their position. We don't want these hairs turning gray.
You gotta start somewhere.
These are the first 2 votes. Yeah. 3.
Campaign dollars.
No, but I think you're right, actually. I completely agree with that. I do think that the media tends to favor one side. And I think that's really, there's a lot of backlash on status quo. That's like kind of clear. Whether you're getting your news from whatever outlet you're getting from. And I think a lot of that backlash certainly doesn't help Biden because he has been protected in the way he has to operate in the media. And I think that's something that's pretty much obvious at this point in terms of interviews being structured and all that. I don't think that helps at all, for sure. But I do think that's interesting because given all that being said, the numbers, at least from the economy, and I think that's where we're into it here, because from this, and we're pointing at this presentation we're kind of looking at, Marcin had pulled up this great data that there hasn't really been a president that's had such a low approval rating with such a decent economy, a pretty good economy. And there's got to be a disconnect there because the economy is not in terrible shape, yet President Biden's approval ratings don't reflect that. So that's kind of really the question I had. And it might be more that, to your point, that everyone feels like, is that really true? Because you know he's kind of being protected in the media. You know that interviews tend to be scripted and you're not really getting a full answer. Whereas someone like Trump, I think one of his biggest assets is he can very much speak off the cuff very naturally, and you can tell if it's right or wrong. He's just giving it to you how it's coming from his mind at that time. So
and I think and it's not like President Trump is necessarily the tell-all be-all for all Republicans, right? I think that we're all referencing him because there's just been this rivalry, and he is obviously the front runner for the Republican Party right now. He had progress for this country and statistics that speak for themselves. I think everyone was better off, everyone was happier. I think people are certainly intimidated globally, and even people who just choose to oppose him, even for one reason. I think that he represents our population in a very strong way. It's not only his presence, but also the fact that he just came from pure business. He's a businessman for whatever it's worth. And some of us, I think, just get sick and tired of hearing politics and being fed nonsense, and like to actually see someone who's a little bit more real, who's going to speak the facts, and also who's not going to be afraid to speak his mind and stand up for his country. That's something I personally have admired about President Trump. And I just see the same old in Biden. Your typical politician, people covering for him, a lot of smoke and mirrors. And when we don't have transparency for the people, usually the end result is not a good one. It's not positive.
One thing that we also looked at the data is a lot of people talk about recessions, and normally recessions happen in the year following a presidential election. There's about a 6 out of 10 chance that a recession happens. So if you just looked at historical data, and if you're a betting man, there's 2025 potentially could be a recession. What is interesting is when the incumbent party loses the election, that probability increases to 70%. So it's high some chance, and Trump is polling very favorably in the polls right now. So, he could potentially win the election in November. The chances that we are going to have a recession actually increase in 2025. So it will be interesting if that happens, and if it does happen, how he's going to react to it, and
Sure.
Well, you know how it is, more spending.
More
Probably,
spending.
And that's kind of that part of the same thing everyone else. That's not unique to Trump. That's the same with every president that's
That's right.
persisted for the last God knows how long.
And soon,
And that's what's got us into the problem today.
Yeah.
I think that's where more people.
and we're going to be in more problems in 4 years' time.
Well, it's plausible. I'll choose to be a contrarian. We'll see. Sprinkle some fairy dust on it and hope for the best.
But the fact that we can have this convo, even though we disagree at different parts, I think that's the part that everyone needs to get more on board with, because
Yes.
things have
Yes,
evolved to a
yes.
state where you can't even talk to someone.
Yeah.
And even though we might not disagree on a lot of things, we're great.
Yeah.
We have fun when you talk, and we can actually be civil about these conversations, knowing that the answer is never one or the other. It's
That
never
is
red or
correct.
blue.
Yeah, that's
The
true.
answer is somewhere in the middle,
That's
and then you
all.
might lean a certain way, and there's nothing wrong with that. So
Cheers to that.
Cheers to
Agree
that.
or peacefully
Cheers.
disagree.
cheers.
Woo!